Boyd Harmon's hand was on Delilah's wrist before she could set down her coffee cup. She had been in the back of her café when he called, not inside the warm part where customers sat, but in the narrow corridor behind the espresso machine where she sometimes stood when she needed to think, surrounded by the smell of roasted beans and the low hum of the refrigeration unit. She had answered because she always answered, even when she knew better. 17 years of being Boyd Harmon's overlooked daughter hadn't cured her of the reflex. Now he was standing in her kitchen in his good coat, the one he wore only when he needed to look like he still had money, and his hand was around her wrist, and his voice was doing the thing it always did when he needed something from her. Quiet, reasonable, coated in a thin film of apology that never quite reached his eyes. "Vanna left," he said. Delilah put the coffee cup down anyway. He explained quickly, efficiently, the way he always explained things when he believed speed was a form of persuasion. Vanna had gone the night before, packed a bag, cleared the emergency account, left with a man named Daniel who Delilah had never heard of and Boyd had known about for 3 months without saying a word. The formal dinner at Royce Callahan's estate was in 4 hours. The dinner where Vanna was supposed to represent the Harmon family in the renegotiation of the contract that kept their father's catering supply business solvent. Without that contract, the company, already bleeding quietly for 2 years, would be finished by spring. And Royce Callahan was not someone you stood up. Everyone in this part of Connecticut knew that name. You didn't have to move in particular circles to understand it. You just had to pay attention long enough to notice which names made business owners go still, which names the local news mentioned carefully, which names nobody said above a moderate conversational tone even when they were in their own homes. Callahan Hospitality Group was the visible part: hotels, event venues, a restaurant chain with locations in 4 states. The rest of it existed in the specific silence that fell whenever someone said his name in mixed company. "You look like her," Boyd said. "Close enough. The dress will fit. You'll be in a room full of people she's barely met. Keep your head down. Don't volunteer anything. Come home." Delilah stared at her father. "I have Polly," she said. "Mrs. Chen can watch her." "Dad." One dinner, his hand tightened, not cruelly, just insistently, which in Boyd Harmon's world was the same thing. You sit at a table, you eat a meal, you don't sign anything, don't agree to anything. Just exist in the room long enough for this not to become a catastrophe tonight. What she wanted to say was no. What she said was nothing, because she was already doing the math. The business failing meant her father's house gone. It meant the silent loan he'd given her to open the café 3 years ago called in immediately. It meant Polly's after-school program, the one she'd finally found that Polly actually loved, suddenly impossible to afford. She had been calculating her family's emergencies since she was 19 years old. She was very fast at it now. "One dinner," she said. Vanna's dress was deep green and too tight across the shoulders, in a way that reminded Delilah, with every breath, that she and her sister were built differently. Vanna had their mother's frame. Delilah had spent 7 years carrying a child on her hip and lifting produce crates at 5 in the morning, and the dress registered this as a problem. She had 2 hours in the car to prepare. She used them to memorize everything Boyd told her. Who would be there? The nature of the contract. The 6 things Vanna had apparently said to Royce during their previous meeting that her father could actually recall. She wrote them down in the small spiral notebook she always kept in her bag. She had learned long ago that her memory was better when she wrote things down, and her stutter, the one she'd carried since she was 12, mostly managed now, mostly a ghost, came back hardest when she was trying to hold too many things in her head at once. The estate sat above the water, lit from inside, the kind of house that didn't need to announce itself because it had been announcing itself for 100 years. She made it through cocktail hour. She made it through the first 3 courses, which was approximately where she stopped breathing normally. The table was 14 people, and most of them were occupied with each other. Business relationships, old ones. People who talked the way people talk when they've been in the same rooms for decades and have nothing left to prove. Royce Callahan sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing for the first hour. He didn't need to. The room organized itself around him the way a room does when the person at its center has the particular quality of attention that makes everyone nearby want to appear worthy of it. He looked at Delilah exactly twice before dessert. The first time was when she was introduced. The second time was harder. She had been answering a question from the man beside her, something about the hotel renovation project, something she'd pieced together from Boyd's rapid briefing, when she made the mistake of using the wrong word. A small thing, structural steel, where she should have said load-bearing, because apparently Vanna had been precise about terminology in their previous conversations, and Royce Callahan was the kind of man who noticed when a word was wrong. His eyes came to her face, slowly, with the quality of attention that didn't feel like interest so much as inventory. She smiled. She picked up her water glass. She felt her pulse in places she didn't normally feel it. After dinner, he asked to speak with her privately. The study was dark furniture and one large window facing the water, and Delilah stood in the middle of it and looked at Royce Callahan looking at her, and understood that the next 60 seconds were going to determine a great deal. He didn't ease into it. He sat on the edge of his desk with his arms crossed and said, "You're not Vanna Harmon." It wasn't a question. And the thing that happened next was not something she planned. Her mouth opened. The words she needed, the reasonable, measured explanation she had rehearsed in the car, rose up and then caught, the way they had caught since she was 12 years old when stress made the mechanism seize. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. Her mouth couldn't find the shape of it. 2 syllables into the first sentence, and the stutter arrived, hard and complete, and she stopped. She had learned to stop. Starting over in a panic made it worse. Plowing through made it worse. The only thing that helped was silence and the written word. She reached into her bag. She took out the small spiral notebook and the pen she always kept clipped to it. She wrote quickly, without looking up, and tore the page out and handed it to him. "My name is Delilah. Vanna is my older sister. She left last night with someone and took money from our family account. My father sent me because he was afraid of what would happen when you found out she was gone. I have a 7-year-old daughter at home. This was not my idea. I am not your enemy. Please don't make any decisions in the next 5 minutes." Royce read it. He read it again. He set it on the desk. "Your father," he said, "sent you to impersonate your sister at a business dinner with me." He said it in the same flat tone a person might use to describe a weather event. Informational, absent of visible judgment. She took the notebook back. She wrote on the other side, "If you handle this tonight the way you could, every associate in that dining room will know that someone replaced Vanna and you didn't notice until after dessert. That's not a story you want circulating. Or you let tonight end normally. You hold leverage over my father indefinitely, and you take the time to figure out what you actually want from the Harmon contract on your own terms. One of those is more useful than the other." He picked up the page. Read it again. "You thought about this before you handed me the first note," he said. She had thought about it in the car. She nodded. "How old are you?" She held up 3 fingers, then 2, 32. Something moved through his expression. Not warmth, something more like recalibration. "Stay," he said, "not as Vanna, as whatever you actually are. We'll figure out what that means tomorrow." She wrote, "And my daughter?" "Make whatever arrangements you need." He set his phone on the desk in front of her. "Use this." She called Mrs. Chen. She kept her voice steady the whole conversation because Mrs. Chen didn't need to worry, and Polly didn't need to feel the shape of something wrong on the other end of the line. She talked to Polly for 3 minutes, school, dinner, the show she'd been watching. And when she hung up, her hands were shaking in a way she couldn't entirely account for. She stayed. The estate had a specific kind of quiet that took 3 days to learn. Not empty, the opposite. Every silence had a weight and a direction and a source. Delilah spent the first 2 days moving carefully through it, mapping the space the same way she mapped new vendor relationships at the café, slowly, by observation, without declaring herself until she understood what she was walking into. She kept writing things down. She always had. It was how she processed. In the small notebook, she recorded what she noticed: arrivals and departures, names overheard in hallways, the texture of conversations she caught in fragments. Not to weaponize, just to understand. You couldn't navigate a place safely if you didn't know its architecture. On the third morning, she was in the kitchen when Royce came down before 7. He poured his own coffee, which she hadn't expected. He sat across from her and looked at the notebook open on the table and said, "What are you writing?" She covered the page, then reconsidered, then slid it toward him. He read for a long time. It was names, arrival times, a note about which staff members deferred to which, a small observation about the way the security rotation changed at 2 in the morning, and in the margin, in smaller handwriting, "Call Polly before 8. She has library day." Royce looked at the margin note. He looked at her. "You're tracking the house." She nodded. "Why?" She wrote, "Same reason I do everything. Because I don't know how long I'm going to be here, and the only protection I have ever had is understanding a room before the room decides what to do with me." He slid the notebook back without comment. He picked up his coffee. "The meeting on Thursday," he said, "with the Aldgate people. I'd like you to sit in." She raised her eyebrows. "You notice things," he said simply, and that was the entirety of his explanation. She sat in. She said nothing. Not because she couldn't, but because the stutter was less reliable in unfamiliar rooms, and she had long ago learned that listening cost nothing and told you everything. She watched the Aldgate representatives. She watched Royce's CFO, a man named Mercer, who sat to Royce's left and said the right things in the right order, and whose eyes moved to the side entrance twice in the first 20 minutes, in a way that had nothing to do with boredom. Afterward, she handed Royce a note. "Your CFO looked at the side door twice, not the main entrance. He's expecting someone he doesn't want you to know about." Royce read it without expression. "You're sure?" She wrote, "I'm sure he did it. I don't know yet what it means." He filed it somewhere in the back of his face and said nothing else. 2 days later, she found out what it meant. She was returning a book to the small study off the east corridor when she heard Mercer's voice from the room adjacent. The door was not fully closed. She had been moving quietly since childhood. You learn that when you never know whether a room is safe to enter before you enter it, and she heard her own designation before she made it past. Not her name, the Harmon woman. And then, she's been here too long. She's going to figure out what we're doing with the quarterly reports before we can finalize the transfer. She stood very still. The voice Mercer was speaking to was on a phone, muffled. She caught fragments. "Aldgate can't wait. If Callahan sees the discrepancy before we close the accounts." Then Mercer said, 3 days. After the board meeting. "We moved the filing, and it looks like it came from his office. By the time anyone looks, we'll have documentation placing it under his signature." She stood in that corridor for a long time after the voices stopped. She thought about what she had heard. She thought about what telling Royce did to her position here. She was already the woman who wasn't supposed to be in this house, already a liability in the accounting of several people who mattered. She thought about Polly, who had called 2 nights ago asking when Mom was coming home. She thought about what not telling him meant, and that path was shorter and considerably darker. She went to find him. He was at his desk. He looked up when she came in. She crossed to him directly and opened her notebook to a clean page and wrote everything she had heard, every word she could reconstruct, in order, with the observation about Mercer at the Thursday meeting appended below. She slid it across the desk and stood back. She watched him read. She had become good at watching him read over the past 2 weeks. His face did very little, but not nothing. If you were paying attention, you could track the information arriving in small adjustments behind his eyes. He read the page twice. He set it down. "Mercer," he said, "just the name." She nodded. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she picked up the notebook and wrote, "I know what this costs me to tell you. I'm telling you anyway, because if he frames you, I'm in this house with no protection and no leverage, and he already thinks I've been paying attention. He's not wrong." Royce read it. He looked at her directly with the first fully unguarded thing she had seen on his face. "Lock your door tonight," he said. "Don't open it until morning unless it's me." She locked her door. Mercer was removed from the estate that night. She didn't know the details. She knew by the quality of the silence in the morning, lighter, like a pressure that had been equalized. Royce told her over coffee, not what had been done, just it's handled, and then after a moment, "You understood the financial implication faster than my legal team did." She wrote, "I run a small business alone. I know what a falsified quarterly looks like because I've had vendors try it on me." Something crossed his face that was the closest thing to amusement she had seen from him. What came next arrived on a Wednesday in the form of her father's car pulling up the drive, and beside him in the passenger seat, Vanna. She heard them before she saw them. Vanna's voice had always carried. From the second-floor window, she watched her sister walk through the front entrance wearing an expression of performative distress that Delilah recognized with the bone-deep weariness of someone who has seen the same play staged too many times. Vanna's version of distress always had clean hair, always had recently applied lipstick. She went downstairs. Vanna told her story to Royce in the sitting room while Delilah stood in the doorway and Boyd sat to the side with his hands folded and his jaw working the way it did when he was calculating whether something was still salvageable. Vanna said she had been missiled about the nature of the meeting. She said things had become complicated. She used the word deceived twice. Then she looked at Delilah. "My sister has been here for 2 weeks collecting information about your operation," she said. "I have proof she reached out to outside parties before she ever walked through your door." Delilah opened her mouth. The stutter arrived before the first word did, the worst timing possible, the worst room possible, and she stopped herself. She breathed. She reached for her notebook. Boyd said, "She has notebooks. She's been documenting everything. How do you think she found out about your CFO? She was placed here to watch you. My competitor arranged it, not me. I didn't know until—" "Sit down," Royce said once. Boyd sat down. Royce looked at Delilah. He didn't look at the notebook. He didn't look at Vanna. He looked at Delilah the same way he had been looking at her for 2 weeks across kitchen tables and study desks and long silences, and she held his gaze the way she'd learned to hold it. Completely, without deflection. Because she had no speech to give and no argument to mount in real time, and the only thing she had left was the fact of herself looking back at him, trusting that he had learned to read what he saw. "Hartley," he said. His head of security appeared in the doorway. "Bring me everything in her room." She closed her eyes 1 second, then she opened them. The notebook came back 40 minutes later. Royce opened it himself, at the table, while Vanna watched with the careful expression of someone who believes they are watching something go exactly right. He read, he turned pages, he went slowly. He stopped at a page in the middle. She knew which page he'd stopped at without seeing it. She knew because she had put it there. The drawing Polly made the week before Delilah left, done in orange crayon on a strip of receipt paper from the café register. 2 stick figures, a tall one with a lopsided ponytail and a small one with a circle head and starfish hands, standing under a sun with 12 rays because Paula always drew extra rays. "Me and Mom," printed in the careful blocky letters of a child who had recently learned to write her own name. Delilah had folded it into the back of the notebook because she hadn't wanted to leave it at home. It wasn't a strategic decision. She just hadn't wanted to be away from it. Royce looked at that page for a long time. Then he looked at Delilah. "These are survival notes," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She nodded. He turned to the last pages, the operational observations, the names, the patterns, then the margins. "Polly, library day. Remember to call." And below it, in smaller writing, she asked if I was scared. I said no. I lied. "That's okay." She doesn't need to carry that. He closed the notebook. He set it down on the table directly in front of Delilah. The evidence your father has, he said, turning to Boyd, came from Mercer, who was working for Aldgate. I know this because I've spent the last 48 hours verifying it. His voice didn't change register. Your competitor sent your family here, not to destroy this household, but to retrieve the one person in it who had already identified his operation before she had any reason to. He looked at Vanna. You came back because Aldgate needed her out of this house. Your father brought you because he still thinks that's negotiable. The room was very quiet. It's not, Royce said. In the days that followed, Delilah sat in the study. Not in the corner, not at a distance, but in the second chair pulled directly beside the desk, and they worked through the shape of what Mercer had compromised and what still needed to be secured. When she saw something that didn't resolve correctly in the documents in front of her, she wrote it on a page and pushed it across without ceremony. Twice he told her she was wrong. She wrote back explaining why she thought she wasn't. The second time she was right, and he integrated the correction without comment except to pick up his pen and keep moving, which she had come to understand was the closest he came to acknowledgement. He asked her once privately what she wanted done with her father. She thought about it carefully. She wrote, I don't want him hurt. I want the contract, the original one that kept his business running. I want it dissolved on terms that leave him with what he actually built, and nothing he borrowed from someone else's power. He spent my whole life making himself large with borrowed things. I want him the size he actually is. Royce read it. That's all? She added one line. That's enough. A man stripped of borrowed power isn't a small punishment. He just doesn't know it yet. He looked at what she had written for a long time. Then he picked up his phone. The morning Boyd and Vanna left, Delilah was in the kitchen. She heard the front door, the car on the drive, the diminishing sound of the engine going away. She stood with her coffee and waited for the thing she expected to feel. It came quieter than she thought. Not grief exactly, the absence of something heavy she'd been carrying, so long it had stopped registering as weight. She set her cup down. She sat with the absence for a while. Royce came in at 8. He poured coffee. He sat across from her. He looked at her face. Polly comes today, he said. She looked up. I had Hartley arrange it this morning. Mrs. Chen is driving her. They'll be here by noon. A pause. I thought you might want to be here. She stared at him. He didn't explain it further. He drank his coffee and looked out the window at the water. She pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Polly arrived at 12:07, trailing her backpack and wearing the purple sneakers she had picked out herself in August and loved with a ferocity that Delilah found disproportionate to the shoes and completely correct for Polly. She came through the front door, looked at the entry hall with the wide-eyed neutrality of a child cataloging an interesting environment, and then found Delilah and crossed the room fast and put both arms around her waist. Delilah held on. Behind them, she heard Royce's footsteps stop. Then Polly leaned back, looked up at him and said, Are you the man who kept my mom busy? Yes, he said. Polly considered this. She's good at being busy, she concluded, which appeared to settle the matter entirely, and then she asked if there was anything to eat. There was. 3 weeks later, Royce put an envelope on the desk between them. She knew before she opened it what it was. 2 documents. The first, a formal dissolution of every arrangement that had brought her here, her father's contract, the obligations that had followed her through the door that night in Vanna's too-tight green dress, all of it closed, with her name on the closure as an independent party. The second, a financial instrument in her name only. No conditions, no restrictions, enough to rebuild anything she chose to build. She read both twice. She set them down. He was watching her with the expression she had catalogued most carefully over the past weeks, the one without the operational layers, the one underneath everything else. The situation that brought you here, he said, started as someone else's transaction. You were put into it without being asked. I kept you in it because it was useful to me. He looked at the documents, then back at her. That's not what I want it to be anymore. She reached for her notebook. He held up one hand. I need to finish, he said. You can take those documents and everything they represent and go home. Back to the cafe. Back to Polly's school schedule and the 5 a.m. crate deliveries and all of it. No one will follow you. No one from here will contact you. He paused. That is a real offer, with nothing attached to it. She kept her hand on the notebook. But if you stay, he said, and something moved in his voice. Something she had heard only once before, in the moment before everything shifts. I want it to be because you chose it. Not the leverage, not the contract. Me, and this house, and whatever this is, because you actually want it. The study was very quiet. Outside, the water moved the way it always moved, without explaining itself, without asking permission. Delilah sat across from the man who had been a stranger, and then an adversary, and then something she did not have a clean word for yet, and she thought about her café, the one she had built from a loan, and 3 years of bad batches of cold brew before she got it right. She thought about Polly drawing suns with too many rays. She thought about a green dress that didn't fit. She thought about the notebook and all the things she had written in it to make herself less alone in an unfamiliar space, and the fact that he had read every single page and then asked her to sit beside the desk. She put the notebook down. She stood up and came around the desk and stood in front of him, and he looked up at her from the chair. Her stutter gathered at the back of her throat the way it always did in the moments that mattered most. She felt it coming. She breathed through it. She did not reach for the pen. I'm not staying because you're powerful, she said, slowly, clearly, letting the words arrive in their own time, because she had learned that the words worth saying could wait for her. I'm staying because you're the first person in a long time who read everything I wrote and still wanted to know more. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and put his hand over hers, where she had braced herself against the arm of the chair. Not dramatically, just steadily. The way load-bearing things are steady, without calling attention to it. All right, he said. She exhaled. The cafe reopened on a Thursday in early spring, because Delilah had never actually stopped running it. Betty had managed the mornings. Delilah had reviewed the accounts remotely. The regulars had been told she was handling a family situation and had responded with the patient loyalty of people who had been drinking her coffee long enough to understand that she was worth waiting for. The chalkboard menu looked exactly as she'd left it. Same 3 tables by the window that got the good afternoon light. Same counter where she stood every morning and thought about what she was building. She was behind that counter on a Tuesday in April when the journalist came in. She was young, earnest, with a recorder and the slightly nervous energy of someone who had been told interesting things about the person she was about to meet and wasn't sure the reality would deliver. She asked for Miss Harmon. Delilah looked up from the portafilter. That's me, she said. The journalist blinked. She had expected something else. Something that looked more like the story she'd been handed, the name she'd been given. Something that matched the version of events that had been circulating. Delilah slid a menu across the counter. Sit down, she said. I'll make the coffee. Tell me what you actually want to know. She paused, and the pause was not uncertainty, but the deliberate timing of a woman who had learned that the words worth saying could afford to arrive on their own schedule. Fair warning, I take a long time to say things right, but when I do, they're worth waiting for. The journalist sat down. Delilah picked up the portafilter. She picked up her pen. She opened her notebook to a clean page. And she began.